Welcome. You're diving in with us today for an insightful look at how one city tackled some really common challenges around housing and growth.
We're focusing on Auburn, Maine.
Exactly. And pulling apart their story as it was shared in a recent Better Cities Project webinar.
Our info comes straight from the YouTube transcript of that talk. You had Auburn's Mayor, Jason Levesque, and Salim Furth from the Mercatus Center.
Right. And our goal really is to understand the practical steps Auburn took with their zoning reforms. We're hoping to uncover valuable lessons, maybe some surprising insights.
Things that could spark ideas right here, for folks in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena.
Definitely. But it's important, isn't it, to remember what Mayor Levesque said early on.
Oh yeah, that while we're talking policy, the reality of actually doing this stuff, it's all tangled up with local politics. Always is.
So true. So let's start where Salim Furth started, in a way. His observation that Auburn is, well, pretty typical.
Yeah, an American every town, I think he called it. Demographically, not super unique, average incomes, typical mix for Maine, that sort of thing.
Okay, so what made them push for change then?
Well, despite being typical, they had this really strong desire for growth. Almost palpable, it sounded like.
Why, though? What was driving that?
It seems to stem from a bigger picture concern. An aging population across Maine, a feeling maybe the state was declining a bit. They wanted to buck that trend.
And the interesting part was the bipartisan support for growth. That feels unusual sometimes.
It really does. Often these things get bogged down in politics, right? But here, the need for growth seemed to cut across those lines. Maybe those economic worries were just that strong.
So for listeners maybe in Deer Park or LaPorte, finding that kind of common ground, that shared goal, that could be key.
Absolutely. Identifying those overarching community aims first. But then how did Auburn translate that general desire into, actual policy?
Right. Because the first idea wasn't the winner, was it? Building more out in the agricultural and resource zones.
No, that one was apparently quite divisive, caused some friction.
So they pivoted, which points to something important, I think.
Listening, right. Understanding those community concerns. The shift towards infill development, focusing on the existing walkable core, that seemed to build more consensus.
It addressed the growth need, but maybe in a less disruptive way for some folks.
Exactly. It wasn't about changing the character of the whole rural area, but building up where infrastructure already was.
Okay, so Auburn wasn't buried under ancient complex zoning like some places, but what was the specific problem they were trying to solve?
Yeah, it wasn't like they had super heavy zoning everywhere. The main issue was a lack of available sites, suitable places for multifamily housing or for those larger walkable subdivisions they wanted.
So not enough options where it made sense to build that kind of density.
Precisely. Their existing infrastructure, sewer, water, roads,
Right.
it wasn't really being leveraged for the kind of growth they envisioned. They needed to enable growth within that existing footprint.
Gotcha. Not sprawling out, but building smarter within. So let's dig into the actual policy changes. The big one seems to be this all of the above residential zoning. What does that mean in practice?
Okay, so think of your typical zoning map, right? Different colors for different uses, single family here, maybe commercial there.
Sure.
All of the above basically wiped away those strict separations, at least for residential stuff. If a lot had sewer and water,
Then you could build pretty much any type of housing. Single family duplex, apartment building.
in theory, yes. They rolled it out in stages, the mayor mentioned, which probably helped. But the core idea is letting the market and the property owner decide the best fit, not the city dictating it for every single lot.
And Salim Furth brought up Houston as a comparison point.
Right. Houston doesn't have that kind of traditional citywide zoning. And the point is, allowing multifamily doesn't automatically turn every single lot into an apartment complex.
Market demand still shapes things. People still build single-family homes there.
Exactly. The expectation in Auburn, like in Houston, is you'll still get a mix. It depends on what people want to live in and what makes sense for builders financially.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, another really practical thing they did was base new regulations on an existing building, the Grace Lawn Apartments. Why was that smart?
Oh, that was quite clever, I thought. Instead of abstract rules, they looked at something tangible already in Auburn.
Something people could see and knew worked.
Right. 3 stories, seemed to fit in, reasonable lot coverage, apparently lower parking than usual. By basically saying, okay, rules will allow this kind of thing, they probably made the changes feel less scary, more grounded.
Building on existing success.
Yeah, and likely tapping into the acceptance that building already had. It shows how finding those local positive examples can be powerful when you're trying to make changes, maybe even here in Southeast Houston.
Then there was the no density limit, technically speaking. Sounds potentially intense.
It does, but Furth added the context, right? Market realities. You can maybe build tiny units with no parking.
But who in Auburn is actually demanding that right now?
Probably not many. So the market itself likely acts as a brake, but it offers flexibility maybe for really small lots or niche housing types down the line.
Okay. Now, this next one seems huge. Eliminating building fees and impact fees. Down to $25 for a new home permit. From potentially thousands.
Yeah, that's dramatic. It really speaks to Mayor Levesque's philosophy.
Which is?
Trusting people, trusting individuals to build appropriately, removing the government cost barrier up front. It's a significant incentive.
You have to wonder what that would do here. What are the fees like in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena now? Could a change like that unlock more building?
It certainly makes you think it's a fundamental shift in the city's role.
They also brought in a form-based code, but with some caveats, according to Salim Furth. First, maybe just remind us what's a form-based code trying to do.
So traditional zoning focuses on the use residential, commercial, industrial. Form-based code cares more about the form.
Like how the building looks and relates to the street.
Exactly. Building height, where it sits on the lot, maybe materials. It's about the physical character of the place, rather than strictly what goes on inside.
And Furth, who you said can be critical of these.
Yeah, he sometimes worries they can be too rigid or subjective. But he seemed to think Auburn's version was relatively good. He called it a box to build within.
Meaning it sets basic physical parameters, but maybe isn't overly prescriptive?
That seems to be the idea, focusing on the external look, how it fits the streetscape, but giving more freedom on internal layout or even use compared to some codes.
And it had a side benefit for homeowners doing renovations.
Yeah, this was interesting. Because the code focused less on the use, properties that didn't quite match the old zoning rules, maybe a house with a small shop attached years ago, were no longer non-conforming in the same way.
So fixing a porch or adding a garage became easier. Less red tape.
Apparently so. Made it simpler for people to just invest in their existing homes. You can see how that could help revitalize older neighborhoods anywhere, including ours.
Now, shifting gears a bit to the politics, Mayor Levesque talked about that classic dynamic, the loud minority versus the silent majority.
A small vocal group really opposed the changes. But he felt that once the benefits were explained, a larger, quieter group was supportive, or at least accepting.
It's a common story in local government, isn't it?
Very common. Opposition tends to be concentrated and loud. Support can be wide but diffuse. His sausage analogy was memorable.
Behind me.
You know, people might not like watching how the sausage gets made, the messy politics, the compromises.
But they like the end result.
Right, like the commercial parking changes, maybe some grumbling during the process, but then Olive Garden opens and people are happy to have it there.
And underlying a lot of this seems to be the mayor's core idea, taking power away from government.
That definitely seems to be a driving principle.
Yeah.
Empowering residents, trusting them with their property, reducing the city's gatekeeping role.
You see it in the fee elimination, the looser ADU rules.
Absolutely. It's about setting a framework, but then stepping back more.
Of course, you can have the best policies, but you need the right people to implement them, the planning staff.
Crucial. The mayor stressed this. You need a planning department that buys into the vision, that's motivated to make it work, not obstruct it. Their staff seem to embrace that growth goal.
Salim Furth had an interesting take on the pace of change. He called it evolutionary, not revolutionary, even though some changes sound pretty big.
Yeah, it sounds like while the mayor had this clear vision, the implementation wasn't one giant overhaul.
More step by step.
Exactly. The planning staff developed and rolled out changes piece by piece. Established the unifying vision first, then made incremental reforms. It lets you adjust as you go, might be less disruptive too.
And this approach, this success, it's getting noticed elsewhere.
Apparently so. The mayor mentioned calls from officials across the country, but maybe the clear sign is the permit numbers.
Right, you mentioned that. Auburn issuing more permits than Portland.
For new housing units, yeah. For a smaller city, that's significant. It suggests developers are responding to that more favorable environment they created.
And a big part of that favorable environment is removing uncertainty. Mayor Levesque claimed they cut it by, what, 90%?
That's a bold claim, but it points to the goal. How do they do it? By simplifying rules, cutting fees, making regulations predictable.
So developers know what to expect. Less guesswork, fewer surprise roadblocks.
That's the aim. Predictability attracts investment. It speeds things up.
Let's circle back to that initial fight over the agricultural zone. It sounds like they didn't necessarily convert opponents, but maybe neutralize them.
That's a good way to put it. By pivoting to infill in the core, they met the main housing need in a way that generated broader support.
It wasn't an either anymore. You could have the walkable neighborhoods and the areas with more space.
Right. They essentially showed there were different markets, different preferences, and the reforms could allow both to coexist without directly competing for the same space in the same way.
And even when new issues popped up, like that petition about commercial activity.
Yeah, in the new zones, they showed some flexibility there.
How so?
Well, they listened. They compromised on some aspects of the commercial rules in those areas based on the petition. But crucially, they protected the core housing deregulation.
So, willing to adjust on the edges, but stuck to the main principle for housing.
Seems like it. A strategic compromise to keep the bigger picture moving forward.
Okay, let's talk accessory dwelling units. ADUs. Second units, granny flats. Sounds like Auburn went very light touch there.
Extremely light. Minimal rules on lot size, setbacks. Basically, if you have the land, you can probably build one.
And that led to some unexpected things.
Yeah, the mayor told that story about the retired firefighter who built an ADU that was actually larger than his main house.
Really?
Yeah, which you probably wouldn't predict or even allow with super prescriptive rules. It shows what happens when you let people figure out solutions for their own situations.
And no parking requirements for ADUs either.
Nope. Which is a big deal. Parking rules often kill ADU projects or make them way more expensive.
Especially for garage conversions, right?
Definitely. Taking away that parking mandate makes converting an existing garage much more feasible. Maybe more so in warmer, drier climates like ours than Maine, but still a major barrier removed.
Interesting. And the city also played a role, kind of matchmaking between developers and local businesses.
Yeah, acting as an intermediary, trying to connect the people building housing with the employers who needed workers housed.
So ensuring the new housing supply kind of matched the local job demand.
Trying to facilitate that connection, yeah. A proactive step to make sure growth served the local economy. Could be a model for our own economic development folks here.
So looking ahead for Auburn, the mayor's not done yet.
No, he's got ambitious goals, reaching 35,000 residents by 2030. That's significant growth.
Would make them the second largest city in Maine.
Right. So it signals this isn't just a one-off project, it's a continued commitment to using zoning reform to drive growth.
And looking even bigger picture, nationally, Salim Furth pinpointed minimum lot sizes as the next big frontier.
Yeah, he sees that as a major lever we haven't pulled effectively in many places.
Why are minimum lot sizes so critical?
Well, think about it. If every new house has to sit on a large plot of land.
It drives up the cost, right?
No.
Land isn't cheap.
Exactly. It makes starter homes much harder to build affordably, and it prevents the kind of denser, more walkable neighborhoods that many people want and that can support transit.
So reforming those rules could unlock more affordable homeownership, potentially, and different kinds of neighborhood design.
That's the argument. More housing types, closer together, maybe more small-scale developers getting involved.
So bringing this all back home, for listeners here in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, what are the big takeaways from Auburn's story that focus on empowering residents, the step-by-step change, adapting to the local scene?
I think it really prompts us to ask, what are the foundational principles that could drive positive change in our housing market, like Auburn did?
And maybe thinking about that balance.
Yeah.
You know, the loud voices versus the broader community needs.
Definitely. And asking hard questions. Are there specific local rules here, maybe ones we don't even think about much, that are actually getting in the way, hindering improvements or opportunities for people?
Auburn's experience really does show what's possible with local action.
It truly does. It all comes down to, well, thinking and acting locally, making those changes in our own communities.
Making things better right here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena.
And look, if you found this deep dive valuable, if you appreciate us bringing this kind of actionable information for local impact,
please consider supporting our work. You can find details at thinkandactlocally.com/donate.
Yeah, the link's right there in the show notes. Every bit helps us keep these conversations going.